welcome to Sunny with a Chance of Chaos, the podcast that is equal parts optimistic and realistic. Join me as we navigate the ups and downs that everyday life brings. I'm Lindsay, and I'm so glad you're here. So get a coffee, get comfy, and get ready for a little bit of life's chaos. Welcome back to Sunny with a Chance of Chaos. It's so great to be here with you again. Today, we're going to dig into one of my favorite topics, vulnerability and shame. Yay! So fun, right? It sounds scary, I know, but it's extremely important and multifaceted. And I have so many thoughts on how it shows up in my life and how it might show up in yours. When Brené Brown first started researching this very fragile subject matter, people were terrified. Everyone wanted this brilliant social science researcher to tell them how to live happy lives and keep it light. But she barreled in with her research and data on how vulnerability is actually the key to living wholeheartedly and therefore happily. My whole life, I have had and still have a very complicated relationship with vulnerability. I fought the good fight against being vulnerable forever. But in recent years, I've discovered the gifts of vulnerability and how to stay shame-free even when all your errored, tired, and imperfect bits are showing. In this episode, I'm going to tie together these three concepts: ego, vulnerability, and shame. They are the best of friends and the worst of enemies. They all have a role to play in our everyday interactions. So let's start with some definitions so we're all on the same page. We will get to the stories about my own struggle with vulnerability in just a minute. Ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. Ego is also the part of ourselves that tries to protect us and thinks its job is to keep us safe from vulnerability and shame. And the ego believes that this job is of the utmost importance. To be clear, everyone has an ego. It's just part of who we are. And not everyone with an ego is conceited or full of themselves. That's another sort of interpretation of that word. Vulnerability comes from the Latin word for wound. Vulnerability is the state of being open to injury, physical or emotional, or appearing as if you are open to injury. In the animal world, exposing that soft underbelly is very vulnerable. In the human world, crying at your son's piano recital in front of 100 strangers could be viewed as very vulnerable. Or asking for what you need, or admitting that your feelings are hurt, all very vulnerable. Shame is what comes after vulnerability. Shame is a feeling of embarrassment or humiliation that arises from the perception of having done something wrong or improper. People who experience shame usually try to hide the thing they feel ashamed of. When shame is chronic, it can result in the feeling that you are fundamentally flawed as a human. So let's sketch this out. Vulnerability and showing our true selves can result in deep shame. So if vulnerability equals shame and we don't want to feel shame, it stands to reason that we would put a proactive tool in place to keep us safe from feeling that shame. And that's where the ego comes in. It's like a shield our brains use to protect us from ourselves. Let's apply an analogy to this. Vulnerability is a dragon, and shame is his fiery breath that has the potential to burn down the castle. The castle is us. Our sense of self, our social status, our everything. The ego is the noble prince or princess that stands guard in front of the castle to keep it safe from being attacked by vulnerability and the resulting shame fire that threatens to take us down. Silly imagery, perhaps, but analogies always help me to understand new and complex concepts. Throughout this episode, I'm going to rewrite this story for you and prove to you that the vulnerability dragon is not as scary as you might think. In fact, it's absolutely necessary for living a full and authentic life. I've known quite a bit about vulnerability and shame for a while now, but I've only recently noticed more and more how the ego plays into this mix. People's egos, their need to protect themselves, are getting in the way of their authenticity. And it makes me so sad because I hid behind my ego for a long time, trying to ensure that none of the cracks showed. I thought if people saw my imperfections, they would think I was weak, they would think less of me. For most of my life, in my mind, being perfect was the only way to stay safe from people's judgment. However, striving towards this so called perfection only served to keep me quiet, silenced, shamed, and afraid to be my true self. My hard-working ego kept telling me to keep it all hidden away for my own protection. They can't know about these imperfections. If they know, they won't like you. And being liked was my number one priority, especially as a teenager. There is a laundry list of things I never wanted people to see. And maybe you hide some of these things from your people as well, maybe? My anxiety, my postpartum depression, mistakes I made at work, anger, sadness, pimples, weight gain, my belly, a dirty house, a lack of money, a lack of confidence, human error of any kind. My ego told me I would feel immense shame if I let any of this show. It told me I would be perceived as weak and not of value. So I had to keep my walls up for protection, or else the whole castle would burn. The only way to keep my people and protect myself was to stay pretty, competent, put together, extremely agreeable. It turns out the result of this was being locked away in the tallest tower behind a door only my ego had the key to. And I surely wasn't ever going to open that door, be vulnerable, and show all my perceived imperfections to the world. It didn't actually keep me safe, though. It kept me small. It kept me denying parts of myself, betraying my own heart, and most importantly, it kept people at arm's length. If I ever let them in past the front gate, they would see what's really going on in here and they'll walk right back out of my life. This is what I thought. So for a long time, I didn't let people get too close to me. No hard conversations, nothing too deep, be the life of the party, always happy and positive, toxically so. Otherwise, they'd be able to see the cracks. My burnt muffins, my terrible sense of direction, my political views, my week's worth of dishes in the sink, my failed knitting project, my desires and silly hopes and pipe dreams. The things I held on to the tightest, locked away the deepest, were my thoughts on sex, my blemishes, my belly. Good, perfect girls don't have any of those, I thought, and I really needed to be a good girl. Liked and admired from afar, but I didn't let too many people get too close for fear I'd be convinced to let the dragon out and be vulnerable. I thought I had hidden these things away where no one could ever reach them. And I put on my mask every morning, carefully placed and tightly secured with a hefty application of toxic positivity and agreeableness. I needed to fit in so badly. But I know now from reading Brene Brown that fitting in is not the same as belonging. I'm going to get into this a little bit more later on in the episode. What I really wanted was to belong. I just didn't know it yet, and I didn't know the difference. So how did I go from being locked away behind a hardworking ego, a sucked-in tummy, and a lot of foundation to being more comfortable with vulnerability? Here's part 2 of my story. I never understood the quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." I thought, why examine it? I'm probably just going to find something I didn't want to find. But then I met my friend S, the very same friend of episode 9 fame, and everything changed. S introduced me to the concept of vulnerability simply by modeling it for me. We were both new moms in the throes of sleepless nights, cranky babies, endless laundry, and hormones. I didn't have a name for it at the time, but I was suffering greatly with what I now know to be postpartum depression. I couldn't really tell anyone, partially because I didn't know what was wrong. I thought I was just super tired and slightly overwhelmed. S and I spent an afternoon together on a blanket with our babies. S was open about her exhaustion as a mother and the struggles she was having. And all of a sudden, it felt safe to open my castle gates just for a minute. We looked at some of my vulnerabilities, my fears, some of my darker thoughts. And in that moment, I was allowed to put down the motherhood ego of, I only use organic cotton blankets and coconut oil as diaper cream, which is what I thought people needed from me. And I could just be Lindsay again. We shared our struggles and I started to heal just a little bit. It felt good to say the things out loud that I had been holding so tightly to my chest. Just the simple act of sharing my sadness and fear with a safe person was the catalyst for what ended up being a healing experience. And after that day on the blanket, that quote made sense. An unexamined life was not worth living. So I started examining things a little bit at a time. And over time, life became more full, more beautiful, more whole, and more worth living. Most of all, I was shocked to discover that being vulnerable with S, which I thought was a new friendship death sentence, did not push her away or cause her to leave or run or judge me. In fact, just the opposite thing happened. By opening up and allowing my brave ego princess to just take a hot 5 minutes and letting some of the cracks show, I entered into the most beautiful friendship I have ever known. S saw my flaws, my belly, my sadness, my anger, my disappointment, my blemishes, and she loved me, not in spite of these things, but actually because of them. And we've continued through the years to be vulnerable with each other and in turn heal and grow closer because of it. So this is super scary stuff. Showing our cracks and flaws to people is the scariest thing for many of us because the shame that can result from being vulnerable is terrifying. So how do we let our guard down, show up and be vulnerable and be our most authentic selves so we can heal and grow and also avoid the shame fire? This has been the most difficult question of my adult life by far, and I now know the answer. Find safe people. Find safe people. Not just anyone deserves your vulnerability. Exposing your soft underbelly to the wrong people can result in injury and shame. You do not have to tell your story to anyone who has not earned the right to hear it and witness it. Only those who have proven to you that they will love your authentic self and love your authentic self hard and stand with you in the vulnerability have earned that right. Their empathy will serve as a mirror for your own self-compassion. And when we play that deadly combo of empathy and self-compassion, shame can't survive. It shrivels up and dies. Some of Brené Brown's research has actually shown this. When we sit with our loving, safe, trusted people and hand them the keys to the highest tower where we've hidden all our opinions, imperfections, mistakes, in essence, our true self, we become a little freer. Free to let those shame-mongering parts of ourselves show, knowing the shame can't survive in the light that is cast by true empathy, belonging, and self-compassion. Side note on belonging, let's go back to that for a second. Brené Brown talks about this in her book, Gifts of Imperfection, but here's my personal take on it. Often what happens is our ego allows us to fit in. It helps us say the right thing, wear the right thing, so that we fit in and people like us and they think we have our shit together. The irony of fitting in is that the version of myself that fit in, quote unquote, for so long craved real and true belonging. But as long as that ego was in the way, people didn't know my authentic self, like who I really was. And I was never going to belong because belonging requires you to be authentic. Fitting in is simpler. It's more superficial than belonging, and it doesn't require vulnerability. However, it also keeps a veil between you and others, so they'll never truly see you and know you. Vulnerability, as it turns out, is the key ingredient to love, friendship, and overall fulfillment in life and success in life. This has certainly proven true for me in my friendships, relationships, at work, in parenting. It shows up everywhere. Without allowing myself to be vulnerable, my people would never truly know me or see me. They would just be getting my ego, which is like a facade. It's not my true self. Okay, so inevitably this will happen. What happens when you think someone is a safe person? You let your guard down, you give that noble prince or princess a break at the gate, and you let that vulnerability dragon loose. And you get burned in the shame fire. This happens. It's happened to me. I can remember getting really emotional during a goodbye speech I had to give for a coworker I cared deeply about. And I'm giving the speech and I feel the tears coming, standing at that mic in front of hundreds of people, and I was powerless to stop them. I got choked up. I stumbled and sniffled my way through the speech, and I got the heck off the stage. I already had a lot of internal shame about the tears in the first place, but then later that day, another coworker came up to me and said sarcastically, "Wow, I didn't know you were so obsessed with her. That was a lot of tears." And bam, the shame fires burned me right to the ground. I had been brave and vulnerable and showed up, showed emotion unknowingly in front of unsafe people, and it stung. It made me never ever want to cry ever again. Really, that was the result. However, guess what? If your authentic, messy self is too much for other people, then they aren't really your people. If being your true self in front of certain people results in shame and not closeness and healing, then they just aren't safe people for you, and you have learned something. You've learned that they have not earned the right to see your true self. You can always test the waters with new people and see how small doses of openness are received. Share one small part of yourself, one small vulnerability as a test. How do they react? Do they laugh it off? Do they make jokes, get uncomfortable? Or do they lean in, listen closely, show empathy? If you try it and it doesn't feel right, then you know they weren't a safe person. Lesson learned, no harm done. So where to begin? If vulnerability is brand new to you, or it's a curse word in your vocabulary like it was for me for 40 years, let me suggest a few places to take off the training wheels to start. Everyone's hot button of shame is different. Maybe one of these examples will resonate with you. Just start with one safe person and one hot button. No need to throw vulnerability around like confetti. No need for that. Maybe you FaceTime with your best friend wearing no makeup and rocking some bedhead. Start there. Maybe have your sister or brother over just to your house and just the two of you for a glass of wine, and wear that tight dress from the back of your closet and don't suck in your tummy. Maybe you tell a story from your day that upset you and allow yourself to cry in front of your wife or girlfriend or boyfriend. Maybe you text that guy you're dating and let him know you're thinking about him first thing in the morning before he texts you. We all know that's pretty vulnerable. Maybe some of these things come second nature to you. I applaud you if so. Maybe the tight dress is just too much at this stage. Just find one safe little moment, let your ego guard down, let that vulnerability dragon in, and just hold his hand. Maybe he won't burn the castle down after all. Okay, the stacks is all about Brene Brown this week. Yeah, sorry. She is the leading researcher in shame and vulnerability, and I have learned more from her than any other author on this extremely important, life-changing topic. She wrote a couple different books. In particular, The Gifts of Imperfection and Daring Greatly focus pretty intently on vulnerability and shame. Her podcast is called Unlocking Us. She has a million great guests on there. She has multiple seasons, lots of great content there. Lastly, she did a TED Talk in 2010 called The Power of Vulnerability. I've watched it twice, once with my kids when they were younger. They really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it too. The subject of vulnerability is not too much for kids. It is important that they understand giving of themselves to safe people and the importance of vulnerability in authentic relationship. And you can start teaching them that from a pretty young age. This week, I would like to show gratitude for all of you out there who are being brave with your lives, showing up in your most authentic ways, and being vulnerable in ways I never thought I could. And for those who still have their walls up, I see you. You don't need to stay silent and quiet and small. You matter and you belong. When the chaos hits and the shame fires are burning, don't forget to turn your face towards the sun. See you next time. Bye.